Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to talk today about Jackson's actual presidency. In this lecture, we'll touch base on four big tenets of his 2 terms in office. If we look at our timeline, let me move my face. If we look at our timeline for this unit, we're talking about John Quincy Adams right here in the corrupt bargain of 1824. This allows Jackson to stir up this popular movement of white male suffrage and get the voters behind him for the election of 1828. When he comes into office, he'll have basically three big issues: the Nullification Crisis, Bank War, and Indian Removal Act, and also what he does with his presidential power for the common man. The first thing we must look at is his presidential power. One of the first things he said a sign of our democratic process was the spoil system. Basically, bringing in your own people, getting rid of those people before. Remember, he's anti-establishment. He wants to drain the swamp. And so he is a big proponent of hiring based on loyalty to your party and fire likewise of those unloyal. He also believed in a rotation in office. No man, he said, no man has any more intrinsic claim to the office than any other. He gives us this idea of the democratic ideal that men were equal and could hold our office, including normal Americans, those who really have moved west, getting out of those elite class, those who own a property, those who own businesses, who have the money. That every American is equal. He also, and this is where he gets different, he's different than Jefferson. Jefferson and the Democratic Republican Party of old believed in state rights, but also less government. He does not. He believes in the common man, meaning that the government's job was to do the bidding of the common man, and that might include using government power to do so. You can see this was his presidential veto. We see it with the bank, recharter of the Bank of the United States, but he vetoed 12 bills from Congress. This is more than the 6 presidents before him. So he is not afraid to use government power, and this is where we get the idea of King Jackson. Okay, the first big issue with him would be Native Americans, and this maybe our founding fathers could have helped, but they left it very generic and didn't talk about it in the Constitution, and so now you're getting the interpretation by the government. Jackson wants them out. He thought the most humane thing was to move all Indian tribes west of the Mississippi. Now, there were tribes that were trying to assimilate into white culture to stay on their land. He still wants them out. He does this. He creates the Bureau of Indian Affairs to help this. We get the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Stop. Okay, our first issue with Andrew Jackson is what to do with Native Americans. And this problem can go back to the Constitution, which doesn't talk to them. So it's up to the interpretation of the people to use the Constitution to do so, but not, and remember, the Constitution doesn't specifically talk about Native Americans. Okay? Andrew Jackson wants them out in the sense that he thinks the most humane thing to do would be to move these tribes, the tribes that are left east of the Mississippi, west into the Indian territory of what is now Oklahoma. And he does this with the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Basically, all Native Americans need to move west of the Mississippi. Now, there are some court cases that are attempting to fight this, and the court and John Marshall is very kind of wishy-washy. You get the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, which basically says that the Cherokee Nation has no right to be in the Supreme Court because it is a foreign, basically a foreign, what word am I looking? Foreign nation. Okay, but then you get Worcester versus Georgia, and it says that states have no right or jurisdiction to move them. Only the federal government does. And so Andrew Jackson has this famous saying, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it, which doesn't happen and is why you get the Trail of Tears from 1838 to 1839 under President Van Buren, which was Jackson's vice president, his second term. moving those Indians. About 15,000 Native Americans would move, about 4,000 would die. And a pretty good illustration of that is this. Take a look, pause it, take a look at this if you would like. The next huge issue is the Nullification Crisis, and this was based on tariffs. The tariff of 1828 would become known as the Tariff of Abomination, and then the one after that in 1832 would be likewise. But this comes back to this idea of the nullification. States can nullify laws they deem unconstitutional. The champion of this at this time was John C. Calhoun, which ironically was Andrew Jackson's vice president his first term. Now, with this, South Carolina is using these tariffs as kind of its platform, but at the heart of the issue is slavery. They see the power growing in the federal government, the existence of slavery, and basically their livelihood and being attempted to be smothered out. We can see that with the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and so Calhoun in South Carolina is going to lead this charge, I guess you would say. And they basically are going to have a special convention in South Carolina after the tariff of 1832, saying that it was unconstitutional and that the state of South Carolina would not pay the tariff or collect dues for it or the money for it. And so Jackson threatens use of military. He gets Congress to pass the force bill, which would allow him to. But then we see the great compromiser, Henry Clay, leads lower rate in the tariff for 1833. It's backed by both sides. Both sides really didn't want to fight. But you should know that Andrew Jackson, again, was not afraid to use the federal government to keep the Union together. He did believe in states, he believed in the common man, but he believed the Union was more important. And in a toast he gave, he said, "Our federal Union, it must be preserved." Kind of a response to this, a response to the Webster-Hayne debate that happened in 1830, which is kind of important to know. Webster, a congressman, basically stated that people, not the state, made the Constitution, which means the federal government is sovereign. That was kind of his premise for this debate. Jackson, people were waiting to see what Jackson would say. In that toast, he gives his message that the Union is more important than states. Calhoun fires back later, "The Union, next to our liberties, most dear." Okay, and so we see this. This is one reason Jackson will join the Whig Party, and also basically just against Jackson, and he won't be vice president the second term. Now, the bank war might be one of the biggest issues. It became a election issue. It was made election issue by Henry Clay and Biddle, who was in charge of the national bank. But we need to understand this a little bit because remember, Andrew Jackson says he's fighting for the common man, and he's not afraid to use the power of the presidency to do so. He believed banks abused their power and served the interest of the wealthy, which was unconstitutional. He has this saying where non-producers contributed nothing to the nation wealth, but profited from the labors of others. Basically, what a bank was for. He didn't trust the banks. He wanted to balance the country. And get rid of the debt, which he did, although many people say that was already in the works and debt wasn't much at the time, so it wasn't just all him. Now, how this became an issue was that Biddle, who was in charge, was persuaded to move up the recharter of the bank from 1836 to 1832 so it could be a big issue in this election. This charter moved, it passed Congress, it went to the president, and the president vetoed it. Okay, this veto basically is saying the people will decide if they want a national bank. They'll vote for Henry Clay, who was running against him. And this is where we really get the Whig Party that forms and gives us our two-party system. But if the people are for or don't want the bank, they'll vote for Andrew Jackson. And the voters agreed. He got 3/4 of the Electoral College vote, and so he takes this as, okay, let's get rid of the bank. The second Bank of the United States recharter was vetoed. It's not passed, and so what Andrew Jackson does is takes all federal money and moves it to state banks. However, this is kind of a little shady because he moves it to banks that have affiliation with government, people in his cabinet, people that he knows, and so they become known as pet banks. This also led to this panic of 1837 over land speculation, printed more and more money. We get inflation. He wants to, in the Species Circular, wants to make it that you can only buy land based on gold and silver. It doesn't really solve the problem, and President Van Buren after him will have to deal with this panic, or that becomes a depression. But really, what you need to know about this bank war is that it's kind of the Federalist Democratic Republican who has the power and who should have the power here, the federal government or the state governments. And with Andrew Jackson, he wins this debate.